Welcome to this explainer, where we are going to completely dismantle that romantic fairy tale image of Venice. You know the one, the postcard version with serene canals, singing gondoliers, and beautiful masks. But today, we're looking right past that gorgeous facade to expose the ruthless, heavily engineered, and intensely commercial machine operating just beneath the surface. Because really, this is the story of a city that, by all rules of geography, simply should not exist. Okay, I want you to imagine for a second that you are ordered to build a great global superpower of a city. You've got choices, right? Maybe a fertile river valley, a highly defensible hilltop, or a broad natural harbor. But instead, you choose mud. You choose hundreds of low, wet, sinking patches of dirt in a salty, mosquito-infested lagoon, a place where fresh drinking water is practically non-existent, crops can barely grow, and a bad storm could literally erase the ground right beneath your feet. It sounds completely absurd, doesn't it? And yet, out of this exact swamp rose one of the richest, most feared empires in world history. So let's dive into our map for uncovering the real Venice. We're going to hit 5 main stops today. First, a city built on mud. Second, Rialto, the true heart of money. Third, San Marco and the art of stealing a brand. Fourth, we'll look at the machine inside the palace. And finally, the ultimate shift in global power. Before we hit our first stop, you've really got to keep this stark contrast in mind. The romantic myth of Venice is that it's this serene, peaceful fairy tale. But the historical reality? It was a ruthless, commercially driven, heavily engineered empire, complete with a secret police force. That serene image you know so well? Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just an image. It was a carefully maintained, state-sponsored piece of propaganda. All right, moving right along to Section 1, a city built on mud. So when waves of invaders like the Huns were pushing terrified mainlanders into the swamp, these refugees had to engineer an absolute miracle out of pure necessity. Now, a lot of people think Venetian buildings just sort of float. Well, they definitely don't. They rest on compressed timber. The early Venetians literally drove thousands upon thousands of wooden piles deep down into the wet mud. And because that buried timber had almost zero access to oxygen, it decayed incredibly slowly. On top of that dense timber foundation, they placed massive stone platforms, and then topped it off with water-resistant Istrian limestone around the lowest parts of the buildings, just to fight back the tide. And here is the incredible irony of their whole situation. The very thing that made daily life so miserable for those early settlers, this shallow, shifting, totally unpredictable lagoon, was actually their absolute greatest defense. Because think about it, an invading army on horseback with heavy carts, they absolutely hated the lagoon. It was way too shallow for heavy warships, but entirely too deep and muddy to actually march an army through. The water completely dictated their survival, and as this quote brilliantly points out, the water shaped everything: their buildings, their transport, their economy, and eventually the entire Venetian character. Okay, now that we've got the physical foundations down, let's travel down the famous Grand Canal to Section 2, Rialto, the heart of money. If you travel down the Grand Canal today, it feels pretty peaceful, right? But I want you to imagine the absolute chaos of the year 1500. This was not some tranquil waterway. This was a crowded, high-speed commercial motorway. Picture cargo boats everywhere, sailors shouting across the water in Greek, German, Slavic languages, servants furiously unloading heavy barrels. And those beautiful palace facades facing the water, they weren't just pretty architecture. The canal was the main street, and those narrow facades acted as giant stone family advertisements. They were literally broadcasting to the entire world. Look at us. We have money, we have ships, and we have power. And just take a look at the sheer variety of goods moving through Rialto, because here's a fundamental truth about Venice. They had practically no dirt. A French noble could get rich off his peasants and his grain, but a Venetian had to look outward. To survive, let alone build massive wealth, they required boats, airtight information, and incredible risk-taking to import these goods. They essentially became the ultimate middlemen, connecting the raw materials of Europe, like silver and timber, with the high-end luxury items of the East, like spices and silk. But listen, you can't build a global trading empire on risk alone, right? You absolutely need trust. How do you hand over a fortune to a merchant who's going to disappear over the horizon for an entire year? Well, Venice solved this by perfectly merging private business with state power. They used strict contracts, notaries, courts, and most importantly, the ducat. First minted in 1285, the ducat's carefully maintained weight made it a highly, highly reliable gold coin. It was essentially a promise made in metal that generated instant credibility across the entire Mediterranean world. Now, let's move away from Rialto, the center of money, to Section 3, San Marco, stealing a brand. Every powerful state needs a good story about why it deserves to exist. And Venice? They call themselves La Serenissima, the most serene republic. It just sounds so peaceful, doesn't it? But let me let you in on a little state secret. This was a totally official, highly calculated propaganda title. It was a carefully constructed facade designed to project this harmonious, almost divine order, which very conveniently concealed the intense factional rivalries, the massive economic inequalities, and the underlying fear that actually kept the wheels of the state turning. So how exactly did they build this brand? Well, through one of the most audacious and, frankly, bizarre heists in human history. Back in 828 AD, according to Venetian tradition, local merchants stole the body of Saint Mark the Evangelist from Alexandria. They literally smuggled a holy relic under layers of raw pork just so the Muslim customs officials wouldn't inspect the cargo. It was a wildly successful, honestly slightly comedic rebranding effort. Because possessing the remains of an evangelist gave Venice the immense religious prestige they needed to match their soaring commercial might. Suddenly, they had a saint to rival Rome's St. Peter. The Doge kept strict control of the relics, which weakened the local bishop. It was just brilliant state branding, beautifully disguised as religion. Right next door to that church sits the Doge's palace. Let's step inside for Section 4, the machine inside the palace. So, Venice had a Doge, sure, but he was absolutely not a king. He lived magnificently, but he operated inside a really strict, tight cage of rules. To prevent any sort of dictatorship, Venice created this intricate system of overlapping councils that monitored the Doge, and, well, monitored everyone else too. You had the Great Council for the hereditary patricians. The Senate handled foreign affairs, war, and trade. And then there was the Council of Ten. They were the truly feared security body that dealt with treason using secret information and incredibly rapid procedures. So yes, Venice loved their checks and balances. But man, they equally loved surveillance. But we have to remember something crucial here. While the Doge's palace organized all the power, they definitely didn't do the heavy lifting. That fell to the arsenalati. These were thousands of highly skilled workers in the arsenal, which was Venice's massive state-controlled military factory. They worked in these dangerous, highly organized, almost industrial conditions long before the Industrial Revolution, just to build the galleys and warships that actually protected Venetian trade. When Venice threw a massive party to celebrate a naval victory, the Doge got all the glory on the balcony, but it was the arsenalati who carried the true heavy weight of the Republic. Which brings us to the famous Bridge of Sighs, connecting the palace directly to the prison complex. Now, the Romantic myth says prisoners sighed as they caught their beautiful last glimpse of Venice. But let's deconstruct that for a second. That bridge really represents a physical journey from the grand spectacle of state power to the dark, brutal coercion required to maintain it. Justice in Venice involved formal courts, yes, but it also heavily involved spies, financial pressure, torture, and some truly filthy, extreme prison cells famously known as the Wells and the Leads. But as we know, nothing lasts forever. For our final stop, let's look at Section 5, the shift in global power. To put it simply, the world quite literally outgrew Venice. Look at this comparison with the Dutch Republic. Venice's power relied super heavily on Mediterranean galleys and a tight regional network in the Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean. But the Dutch, and the Portuguese before them, they were building these massive, heavy, ocean-going sailing ships specifically designed for global oceanic networks. So when the center of global economic gravity fundamentally shifted away from the Mediterranean and over to the Atlantic, Venice simply couldn't pick itself up and move. And walking through this timeline, you can really clearly see that shift. Back in 1204, the Fourth Crusade helped Venice become a true imperial power. But fast forward to 1498, Vasco da Gama sails around the Cape of Good Hope, allowing Portugal to completely bypass and challenge Venice's monopoly on the spice route. Venice managed to adapt and hold on for centuries, but eventually, in 1797, Napoleon marched in and ended the Republic. However, Venice was incredibly clever. When they finally lost their military edge, they pivoted hard. They turned pleasure into a massive economic sector, selling masks, gambling, opera, and pure spectacle to tourists. It's honestly a business model they still rely on today. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought. Venice was this crazy environmental experiment, a ruthless trading network, a strict oligarchy, an industrial factory, and a brilliantly maintained illusion. It is a city that literally should not have existed. So the next time you look at images of Venice, or if you're lucky enough to actually walk its streets, ask yourself, are you just seeing a romantic fairy tale? Or are you finally seeing the brilliant, heavy machinery churning away just beneath the water? Thank you so much for exploring the real Venice with me today in this explainer.